The Pacific sky still slept beneath a shroud of darkness. Only along the far horizon did the faintest orange thread of dawn bleed upward, as if the world itself were holding its breath. Steel decks trembled under the weight of engines already growling like caged predators, and men in oil-stained flight suits moved as shadows across Task Force 58's carriers. Each breath carried the bitter tang of aviation fuel, salt spray, and anticipation. June 19, 1944. By nightfall, this date would be carved into history as the day Japan's aerial empire shattered. But in the pre-dawn haze, none of the men truly knew what awaited them. Lieutenant Commander David Harrington ran a gloved hand along the cold fuselage of his F6F Hellcat, tail number 29. He had flown Wildcats in 42 stubby, underpowered machines that had felt like sending paper kites against predators. Back then, every time he climbed into the cockpit, he carried the taste of fear on his tongue. The Japanese Zero could twist, climb, and kill with a grace that seemed unnatural. Many of his classmates from flight school never survived their first encounter, but today was different. The Hellcat was more than a machine. It was an answer, an armored fist forged from lessons written in blood. Its cockpit was a fortress, its fuel tank self-sealing, its wings burdened with 6 heavy, 50 caliber Brownings. Beneath the cowling growled a Pratt & Whitney R-2800 engine, 2,000 horses waiting to be unleashed. Harrington whispered to himself, not a prayer, but a promise. This time, we are ready. A few feet away, his wingman, Lieutenant Samuel Ortiz, adjusted his harness. Barely 20. Ortiz still carried the smile of a college kid, but his hands moved with a steadiness that belied his age. Harrington had taken him under his wing, sensing in him not bravado, but resolve. You think they'll come all at once? Ortiz asked, over the whine of engines warming up. If they're smart, yes, Harrington replied, a half smile breaking his weathered face. But smart doesn't win wars anymore. Mass does. Mass. That was America's new weapon. Not just in ships or guns, but in production. In 1944, while Japan struggled to scrape together a few dozen planes a month, American factories rolled out thousands. While Japanese cadets entered combat with 50 hours of flight time, American rookies graduated with 300. It was mathematics as much as courage, and the equation was merciless. Still, raw numbers could not erase memory. Harrington often thought back to a diary he once read, smuggled from a downed Japanese pilot. The words had stuck with him. I know our days are numbered, but I will fly until I burn. Better to vanish in fire than return in shame. Those boys across the sea, however misled, were not faceless. They, too, believed. The night before, on the USS Independence, the squadron had gathered in the ready room. Captain Walter Green, commander of Air Group 22, stood before a map pinned with grease pencil lines of attack. A veteran of Midway, Green bore scars in his voice as much as on his face. Gentlemen, he said, gravel low, eyes alive with fire. Tomorrow is reckoning. Task Force 58 is stretched across 15 miles of ocean. Our battleships guard the line. Our carriers hold the punch. And you? He stabbed the board with his pointer. You are the shield. The Japanese will come with everything they have left. You will throw it back. No theatrics, no sentiment, just fact. And every man in that room knew the truth of it. Beyond the horizon, Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa was indeed mustering his Storm 9 carriers, nearly 400 aircraft. Yet many of his pilots were little more than boys, fresh from stripped-down training programs, some with less than 50 hours in the sky. Their machines, too, bore the strain of war. Zeros, Vals, Kates, even the newer Judy dive bombers, all fragile when stacked against the rugged Hellcat. As dawn crept higher, Harrington strapped into his cockpit. The world narrowed to gauges, switches, and the heartbeat of the engine. His squadron commander, Commander Frank Dalton, broke the silence over the radio. Dalton had flown through Guadalcanal, and his calmness carried the weight of a man who had already looked death in the eyes. Listen up, Dalton said. Intel confirms enemy strength over 400 aircraft, 4 waves, fighters, dive bombers, torpedo planes. Remember your training. Boom and zoom. Use your altitude. Never dogfight a zero. Hit hard, climb away, live to strike again. Static crackled, then silence. Even the ocean seemed hushed. "Hey, skipper," Ortiz's voice cut in, light but sharp. "Let's bag some meatballs today." Harrington smirked. "Stay on my wing, Sam. We'll send them all back to the sea." At 8:30, the signal flags rose. "Launch all fighters." Deck crews surged into motion, practiced as clockwork. Wings locked, fuel lines detached, ammunition belts fed. Catapult officers raised gloved hands, then dropped them. One by one, Hellcats thundered forward, claws of steel leaping into the air. The roar was deafening. The smell of cordite, oil, and sea spray mingled into something almost metallic on the tongue. Harrington felt the jolt as the catapult hurled him into the void, then sudden freedom as his Hellcat clawed for altitude. The Independence shrank beneath him, a sliver of steel adrift in endless blue. Ortiz slid into formation on his right wing, steady, unflinching. At 15,000 feet, the radio crackled again. "Multiple bogeys, bearing 270. Estimate 80 plus. Captain Green's voice broke in. "All units, intercept, do not let them through." And then shadows. At first faint, like smudges against the morning light. Then darker, then countless. A black swarm spreading across the sky. Crimson circles glinting on wings. Zeros, Vals, Kates. A storm rolling eastward, straight toward Task Force 58. Harrington's breath slowed. His hand tightened on the throttle. The first wave was here. "Contact," Commander Dalton said, voice steady. "Remember, altitude is life." Harrington nosed down, sun glaring off his canopy. The Hellcat roared as gravity pulled it into a dive. He fixed on a single zero, its silver skin bright against the morning. The enemy pilot never saw him coming. At 1,000 yards, Harrington squeezed the trigger. 6 Brownings spat fire. Tracers laced the sky. The Zero's wing shattered, cockpit erupting into flame. In an instant, it was gone, spiraling into smoke. "Splash 1, Harrington said calmly, pulling up into the climb. Ortiz's voice followed a heartbeat later. "Got one, Judy. She's burning." All across the sky, fire bloomed. The Battle of the Philippine Sea, the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, had begun. The Pacific sky had become a battlefield of streaking fire and tumbling wreckage. In less than half an hour, the first Japanese wave disintegrated under the storm of Hellcats. Fewer than 10 enemy aircraft even reached within striking distance of the fleet, and those few never escaped the gauntlet of anti-aircraft fire waiting for them. Yet the battle was far from over. At 10:30, new reports filtered through the radar screens aboard the USS Lexington, another 120 Japanese aircraft rising from the west. This wasn't desperation, it was commitment. Ozawa had hurled his second fist, determined to shatter Task Force 58 before it could strike the Marianas. Lieutenant Commander Harrington adjusted his gloves and flexed his fingers over the stick. His Hellcat still had over 1,000 rounds of ammunition, plenty of fuel. Ortiz's voice came back over the radio, ragged with adrenaline but steady. "You ready for round 2, Skipper?" Harrington glanced at the horizon, shadows swelling once more. Always. The second wave was larger, tighter, more disciplined than the first. Black specks, multiplied against the sunlit canvas of the sky, until they resembled a migrating swarm. Dive bombers trailed torpedoes. Fighters circled like hawks above them. To an untrained eye, it was endless. Ortiz let out a low whistle. "That's a whole damn Air Force." "Then let's bury it," Harrington replied. The order was given. 36 Hellcats peeled into a dive, engines howling as they cut across the sky like steel scythes. Below, Japanese formations struggled to adjust. Veterans barked commands, but the green pilots broke ranks, nerves fracturing in the face of the oncoming storm. Harrington locked onto a Val dive bomber, its bomb slung awkwardly beneath its belly. He squeezed the trigger, tracers slashed through the morning light. The Val erupted in flame, its payload detonating mid-air with a thunderclap that scattered wreckage like shrapnel. "Splash 1, Val," he called. Ortiz came screaming across Harrington's left, guns chewing a Judy bomber to pieces. "She's down," Ortiz shouted, but his voice cracked less from fear, more from disbelief at the sheer volume of targets. Zeros pounced from above, trying to force the Hellcats into turning duels. Harrington felt his plane shudder as bullets stitched across his wing. He rolled hard left, dove, then snapped into a climbing turn. The Hellcat, heavy but brutally powerful, dragged itself upward. The Zero followed too close. Its climb faltered, its engine wheezed. That was all Harrington needed. He rolled inverted, dropped behind it, and fired. The Japanese fighter blossomed into smoke and flame, spiraling down into the waves. Splash another, Harrington muttered, sweat beading on his forehead. All across the sky, the same grim dance played out. Hellcats slashed, dove, and climbed again, while Japanese aircraft scattered in confusion. Many of their young pilots had been rushed through training 50 hours in the cockpit at most, some barely knowing how to navigate by instruments. Against veteran Americans, with triple that experience and machines designed to endure punishment, the imbalance was catastrophic. Captain Walter Green's division intercepted the torpedo planes. These were Nakajima B-5Ns, the same Kates that had crippled Pearl Harbor. 3 years earlier, they had been instruments of terror. Today, they were crawling targets, lumbering at barely 200 miles an hour. Green himself destroyed 2 in a single pass. His squadron ripped through the formation, sending flaming wreckage into the sea until the sky was littered with broken wings. Still, the Japanese pressed on. At 12, radar picked up yet another Wave 80 aircraft clawing toward the fleet. Harrington steadied his breath as the horizon darkened for the 3rd time. "They're throwing everything they've got," he said into the radio. Ortiz's reply was quiet, almost reverent. "This is it, their last strength." The Hellcats rose again, relentless. Fresh squadrons launched as others refueled, a seamless rotation of steel and flesh. Against them came boys who had been flying biplanes in training weeks earlier, now ordered into combat against the most advanced naval fighter in the world. Harrington dove on a Judy bomber, his tracers ripping the engine apart. The pilot bailed out, parachute blooming like a white flower against the sky. Below, he drifted helplessly into a sea, already slick with oil and burning wreckage. Ortiz destroyed a Zero with a short burst, the enemy dissolving into smoke. His voice cracked over the radio. "They're falling like flies." Harrington could only nod, though no one could see him. The Pacific sky resembled a forge, smoke trails etched across the blue. Aircraft spiraled into the sea, trailing fire, and every few seconds, another explosion flared below. The ocean itself seemed to boil under the weight of wreckage. At 13:15, the radar identified a 4th wave. This one was smaller, 50 aircraft, but tellingly, fragile. Old training planes, twin-engine relics, anything with wings. Ozawa was emptying his hangars, throwing scraps into the maw. Dalton's voice crackled over the channel, grim but unyielding. "Gentlemen, finish it." The Hellcats obliged. The 4th wave never even reached the American fleet. Old clods and lumbering bombers burned in seconds, ripped apart by machine gun fire before they could line up an attack. By the time the smoke cleared, Ozawa's strike force had been annihilated. And then came silence. Harrington leveled his Hellcat at 12,000 feet, eyes scanning the horizon. The once crowded sky was now empty, save for smoke plumes rising like tombstones. Ortiz's voice came through, quieter now, heavy with disbelief. "Skipper, how many do you think we got?" Harrington exhaled slowly, staring at the miles of burning sea below. "Too many to count." By mid-afternoon, the numbers told the story. Nearly 400 Japanese aircraft destroyed. American losses? Fewer than 30. The kill ratio more than 14 to 1. It wasn't merely a victory. It was extermination. But as Harrington circled back toward the Independence, the adrenaline began to fade, replaced by a heaviness in his chest. Those boys he had seen bailing out, their faces flashing for an instant through his canopy glass, they weren't monsters. They were sacrifices to an empire unwilling to admit its own collapse. That thought haunted him more than the gunfire. By late afternoon, the Pacific sky hung quiet, eerily quiet. The roaring engines, the chatter of gunfire, the blossom of explosions had all faded, leaving only columns of smoke clawing into the heavens and the hiss of waves swallowing wreckage. What had begun as the largest carrier strike Japan ever attempted had ended in silence, its wings torn away in a matter of hours. Lieutenant Commander Harrington guided his Hellcat back toward the USS Independence. His hands trembled on the stick. Not from fear, but from the exhaustion of hours spent in the crucible of combat. His fuel gauge sat near empty, ammunition belts nearly dry. He keyed the radio. "Independence, this is Harrington, returning to base." The calm voice of the deck officer came back instantly. "Copy, Harrington. You're cleared to land." The approach was rough. The carrier rose and fell with the swells, but the Hellcat's hook caught, slamming the machine to a halt. For a moment, Harrington just sat there, sweat soaking through his flight suit, his heart hammering against his ribs. Alive. On deck, the air was electric. Pilots climbed from cockpits, some laughing with manic relief, some stumbling in dazed silence, others so drained they could barely walk. Ground crews swarmed across the deck, checking fuel lines, patching bullet holes, reloading ammunition. The smell of cordite still clung to their uniforms, mingling with salt spray and oil. Ortiz staggered toward Harrington, helmet tucked under his arm, face streaked with soot and sweat. "Skipper," he panted, catching his breath. "I can't even count how many went down today." Harrington followed his gaze toward the horizon, where oil slicks glimmered across the sea like black mirrors. Tiny specks bobbed among the wreckage, Japanese pilots clinging to life rafts, some waving frantically, others drifting motionless. Harrington's voice was low, almost solemn. "Neither can I, but I know what it means." That evening, in the carrier's mess, the mood was surreal. Not somber, not grim, almost jubilant. Men laughed, trading stories of dogfights, miming dives and kill shots with their hands. Voices buzzed, alive with adrenaline, as if recounting legends instead of hours-old memories. Pilots claimed kills, compared tracers, relived near misses, yet beneath the carnival atmosphere ran a current of something unspoken. Every man knew how close the day had come to disaster if not for their machines, their training, and the sheer, relentless weight of American industry. Later, Captain Walter Green addressed the squadron. He stood at the front of the room, his face lit by the dim glow of swinging lamps, his voice cutting through the chatter with steady gravity. "Gentlemen," he began, "today we destroyed Japanese carrier aviation. Not bruised it, not weakened it, destroyed it. 400 enemy aircraft gone. And we lost fewer than 30. The room fell into a heavy silence. Numbers had a way of stripping away bravado. Harrington leaned back, letting the words settle into him. He thought back to Pearl Harbor, to those terrifying first months when the Zero had owned the sky, when young Americans were fed into battles they could not win. How far they had come in 2 years, from desperation to dominance. Later still, Harrington walked alone onto the deck. The night air was thick with salt and the distant smoke of battle. Fires still burned faintly on the horizon where aircraft had fallen. He leaned against the rail, watching the waves shimmer with oil. Somewhere out there, Japanese survivors floated in the wreckage. Boys barely older than Ortiz, their lives gambled away by commanders who could not face reality. Harrington whispered into the night, words only the sea would hear. "We broke them today, and they'll never recover." He wasn't wrong. For Japan, the loss was catastrophic beyond the tally of destroyed aircraft. Its greatest wound was invisible, the shattering of its irreplaceable core of veteran aviators. Decades of experience had been extinguished in hours. Replacement pilots would come, but they would be children barely trained, shoved into cockpits of fragile planes, sent against the relentless tide of Hellcats. Meanwhile, America's engine of war roared at full throttle. Factories on the home front produced 2,000 aircraft every month. New squadrons graduated weekly, pilots polished, confident, and equipped with machines that forgave mistakes and punished recklessness. Industry had become strategy, and Japan could not compete. By midnight, the tally was official. Nearly 395 Japanese planes destroyed, 29 American losses. A kill ratio of more than 14-1. The numbers themselves felt unreal, like the score of a rigged game, but no one doubted them. The ocean itself testified with the wreckage of hundreds of planes drifting among slicks of burning oil. As Harrington turned from the rail, he passed Ortiz sitting on a coil of rope, helmet dangling from his hands. The young pilot stared at the dark horizon, his grin gone, his eyes shadowed. "Skipper," he said quietly, "I saw one of them bail out today. Just a kid." He looked right at me before his chute opened. He couldn't have been more than 18. Harrington paused, searching for words. He thought of the diary he'd once read, of the Japanese pilot who wrote about flying until he burned. He thought of his own friends who had gone into the sea in '42, swallowed by the same Pacific that now swallowed their enemies. "War doesn't ask how old you are," Harrington finally said. "It just takes." The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, as it would soon be called, was more than a battle. It was annihilation, on a scale unseen in the history of naval aviation. Japan had lost not only machines, but the very essence of its air arm, the veteran elite who once carried its empire across the Pacific. For America, it was proof that the tide of war had not only turned, but become unstoppable. Yet, for the men on the decks that night, it was not statistics or strategy that lingered. It was the faces glimpsed for an instant through a canopy glass, the parachutes drifting into flames, the fleeting thought that those enemies had once been boys dreaming of flight, just as they had. The laughter in the mess hall could not erase that truth. The Pacific had claimed its due. Morning broke over the Philippine Sea with an uncanny calm, as if the ocean itself sought to conceal the scale of what had transpired the day before. No swarms of Zeros prowled the sky. No columns of black smoke climbed into the heavens. Only the low hum of Task Force 58's carriers pressing westward disturbed the silence. Yet beneath that calm, history had shifted. On June 19, 1944, Japanese naval aviation had ceased to exist as a coherent fighting force. Nearly 400 aircraft destroyed, dozens of irreplaceable veterans lost. Decades of carefully built expertise erased in hours. From that day forward, the Pacific skies belonged not to the Zero, but to the Hellcat. Lieutenant Commander Harrington stood at the deck rail of the Independence, a mug of bitter coffee warming his hands. His body ached from exhaustion, but his mind refused rest. He thought of the terrified Japanese boys he had seen bailing out of their burning machines, of the parachutes drifting helplessly into the waves. Somewhere in those waters, hundreds now floated or sank, their sacrifice unnoticed by the empire that had sent them to die. Ortiz joined him, eyes squinting against the bright morning Sunday. "Hard to believe, isn't it?" he said. 3 years ago, they owned the sky. Now, he gestured to the empty heavens. "Gone. Not just gone," Harrington answered, voice low. "Erased." The truth lay in numbers as much as in memory. In 1941, Japan could field elite squadrons of pilots, trained through grueling years of instruction. But by '44, training had been stripped to the bone. Cadets rushed through in weeks, thrown into battle with 50 hours in the cockpit. In contrast, American cadets graduated with over 300. The result was merciless arithmetic. Japan sent boys, America sent professionals, and behind those professionals stood something greater still: the arsenal of democracy. While Japanese factories scraped to produce a few hundred planes each month, American industry churned out 2,000. While Japan bled experienced pilots, America graduated new squadrons by the week. War had shifted from valor to systems, and Japan was being crushed beneath the weight of that transformation. That evening, Captain Walter Green addressed his air group once more. The men crowded into the ready room, the air thick with fatigue and smoke. Green's voice was solemn, his words deliberate. "Gentlemen, you should understand what we did yesterday. This wasn't just a battle. This was the end of Japanese carrier aviation. 400 planes destroyed, their veterans gone. From here on, every man they put in the sky will be a boy with hours, not years, behind him. The Zero that once terrified us has been stripped of its teeth." The pilots sat in silence. Even the younger ones, flush with adrenaline, seemed sobered. They understood. What they had seen was not merely victory, but extermination. Yet Harrington felt no triumph. Later that night, as the carrier plowed westward, he wrote in his journal by the dim red light of his cabin, "We broke them today. But it wasn't sweet. It was slaughter. Those boys never had a chance." Their commanders sent them into the fire and called it duty. We killed an air force, but we also killed a generation. Historians would later call it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, a name that suggested ease, almost mockery. But for those who fought it, the reality was not so simple. Yes, the kill ratio was staggering, 14-1, but behind each number lay a life. For Harrington, the victory carried a heaviness that numbers could not erase. Still, the consequences were undeniable. By destroying Ozawa's strike force, America had opened the path to the Marianas. Saipan, Guam, and Tinian would soon fall, providing bases from which the new B-29 bombers could reach Tokyo itself. The Pacific War, once fought island to island, had shifted into a campaign aimed directly at Japan's heart, and the Hellcat was the instrument that made it possible. It was not elegant like the Zero, nor romanticized like the Spitfire. It was heavy, forgiving, brutally efficient. In the hands of a rookie, it survived mistakes. In the hands of a veteran, it was lethal. By war's end, it would claim over 5,000 enemy aircraft with a kill ratio of 19-1, the most dominant naval fighter in history. The Zero's reign, born in fire at Pearl Harbor, ended in fire over the Philippine Sea. For 3 years it had terrified the Pacific, twisting through dogfights like smoke, its legend larger than life. But legends cannot fight mathematics, and myths cannot survive against industry. The Hellcat had done more than kill planes. It had killed an era. On deck that night, Harrington looked across the rows of folded wings, Hellcats gleaming in the moonlight like silent guardians. The men who flew them traded stories and laughter. But beneath it, Harrington sensed what none said aloud, that victory came not just from courage, but from the cold efficiency of a nation that could outbuild, outtrain, and outlast any foe. The Pacific was no longer contested. It was decided. The weeks that followed, June 19th, unfolded with a momentum that seemed unstoppable. With Japan's air arm shattered, Task Force 58 moved like a blade across the Pacific, carving open paths that had once seemed unreachable. Saipan fell, then Guam, then Tinian. From those islands, the giant B-29 bombers rose like thunderheads, carrying their fire directly to Tokyo. The annihilation of Ozawa's fleet air arm had not only been a battle, it had been the gateway to Japan's doorstep. Lieutenant Commander Harrington felt the shift in his bones. No longer did each launch carry the gnawing fear of 1942, when every zero in the sky had seemed a phantom predator. Now, when his Hellcat's wheels left the deck, it was not desperation that carried him upward but certainty. The skies belonged to them. And yet, victory carried a shadow. One evening, Harrington walked the carrier deck alone, the horizon glowing faintly from burning oil slicks still adrift days later. He thought of Ortiz's words, of the Japanese boy he had watched bail out, parachute blossoming before the sea claimed him. The face haunted him, a fleeting glimpse of a life extinguished by forces far larger than any single pilot. Harrington whispered to the waves, "They believed as much as we did. They just never stood a chance." Captain Walter Green, too, felt the weight of it. In a letter home to his wife, later preserved in the Navy archives, he wrote, "It was a victory, yes, but I cannot call it glorious. It was slaughter. And the worst of it is, knowing we'll have to do it again tomorrow, and the next day, until there is nothing left of them." What made the slaughter possible was not only the Hellcat's power, but America's relentless capacity to produce. Back home, factories in places like Grumman's Bethpage plant churned out 400 Hellcats every month, while Japanese workshops lacking aluminum, fuel, and trained hands could barely replace a fraction of their losses. Where Japan sent cadets into combat with 50 hours of training, American pilots arrived with 6 times that, sharpened by instructors who had themselves survived the crucible of earlier battles. The contrast was staggering. By July 1944, Japan's naval air arm was effectively gone, leaving its carriers as floating targets without purpose. America, by contrast, had become a nation of wings, pilots, machines, logistics, all woven into a system so vast it could not be undone. The Battle of the Philippine Sea had proved something deeper than tactical supremacy. It proved that war in the modern age was no longer about the few, the aces, the legends. It was about systems, about nations that could outbuild, outtrain, and outlast. Harrington realized this as he leaned against the rail one night, watching the sunset paint the Pacific in streaks of crimson. Around him, Hellcats stood in them, neat rows, wings folded like sentinels. The men laughed nearby, voices buoyed by relief, but Harrington felt the heaviness of what lay ahead. The war was far from over. There would be Iwo Jima, Okinawa, the firebombing of Tokyo, and finally, the shadow of the mushroom cloud. But June 19th had already sealed the fate of the Japanese Empire. The Zero, once a symbol of terror, had died in those skies. Months later, when Tokyo finally trembled beneath American bombs, it was from airfields won in the Marianas. And when the war ended aboard the USS Missouri, Hellcats circled above Tokyo Bay, their presence a silent reminder of the battle that had broken Japan's wings forever. Historians would remember the day as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, a name that trivialized its enormity. But to Harrington, Ortiz, Green, Dalton, and the thousands who flew, it was something far greater, a reckoning written in fire and steel. They had proven not only courage, but supremacy. And yet, the memory carried an unease that never left Harrington. He would later write in his private journal, "I saw brave men die that day, not only ours, but theirs. They died believing they could turn the tide. We proved them wrong, but I will never forget the look in their eyes as their machines burned." The Battle of the Philippine Sea was not merely a chapter in the Pacific War. It was the moment when the age of the Zero ended, when the Hellcat ascended into legend, when the Pacific itself declared, "The sky belongs to America." For the men who lived it, it was not just victory. It was the day history fractured, and the future was decided.